Thank you, Brother Ken, and good morning, my dear brothers and sisters. Fellow pilgrims on the journey of hope. We've already seen, so this part will be quite easy for you to pick up. We've already seen at least twice the concern of the Apostle Paul for the Ecclesias that he established, that he wanted to go back frequently to those places and to strengthen them and build them up. We could almost skip that, but we do want to look at it a bit more carefully and understand how big an issue that was for the apostle and therefore how important it is for us too. The apostle was very desirous of strengthening all the disciples that he had become aware of. And so if we come to Acts 18 as a first example, verse 23. And after he had spent some time there, that's in Antioch, he departed and went over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. And that's the lead into the chronological sequence that we're trying to follow as well, although that may not always be so obvious too, because I know I'm dealing with this subject much more thematically than chronologically, but believe it or not, there is a chronological sequence in what I'm saying. And we're picking up now this third missionary journey. It's an extraordinary journey for a number of reasons, because when we see that he has arrived at Ephesus in chapter 19, verse 1, he meets Apollos and so on, the story goes on there. But if you come a little further down to chapter 2, verse 8, there is a reference to how long he spent there in Ephesus. And he went into the synagogue and spake boldly for the space of 3 months. But then you come down to verse 10. This continued by the space of 2 years. And if you come over to chapter 20, verse 31, you will see that in all he spent 3 years at Ephesus. Therefore watch and remember that by the space of 3 years I ceased not to warn every one of you night and day with tears. This is the longest time Paul spent anywhere apart from his upbringing in Tarsus and his later time there after his conversion. Once he left Tarsus, if you wanted to say anywhere was his permanent abode or semi-permanent abode, it would be Ephesus. I've made the point, I think probably the first study, that Antioch became his kind of home, but in terms of length of time, Ephesus was the longest. And we've made the point, whether it be Iconium or whether it be Antioch or wherever, Corinth, that the impact he must have had for those extended periods would have been outstanding. Well, here we've run out of superlatives, or I have anyway. You kind of have to say, well, that 3 years would even be greater. I'm reminded of driving through the Rockies and looking at a mountain and going, wow, look at that fantastic view. And after about half a dozen of those, you just go, huh? Wow. There's no words left. It's just awesome scenery. And you cannot think of any more words to say. You've run out. And we need to think of it in that way, I believe, that the apostle probably it's difficult to get into his mind, is what I'm saying. We can read it, and it's a story that's straightforward. It's not a complicated story. But to try and understand how he felt about these disciples, one of the ways is to see that he was so anxious to build them up that in this instance in Ephesus he would spend 3 whole years there. And it's apparent too that he went around the surrounding area as well, as you can imagine you might. Wherever you happen to live, you would visit areas nearby as a matter of course, and you get to know people in a wider circle. But it's a bit more of an effort to go interstate, or and even more so to go overseas. And it's clear that the apostles did speak around the area of Ephesus in the province of Asia to some degree, whilst he was based in Ephesus. Well, after that period, we'll come back to that in a moment. The journey, as we described it, goes on. He arrives in Macedonia, in Greece. You'll see in chapter 20, verse 2. He's there for 3 months as well. And it goes on, whole list of places, and eventually back in Jerusalem. So that's this journey. We call it the third missionary journey, rightly so, and it lasted for 5 years, but 3 of those were in Ephesus. So it's almost, as we said yesterday, it's really 2 journeys. It's a journey to Ephesus, then based there for 3 years, and then another journey back to Jerusalem. Not to Antioch, just by the way, notice. And so like we saw with the second journey, it's almost really 2 journeys that we lump together and call it a single journey. And this is illustrated also with a table. You can see in the middle there the 3 years at Ephesus and 3 months in Greece. And so there's really quite a strong break between the 2 halves, the top and the bottom. And so it's reasonable to describe it almost as 2 separate journeys. Well, this place, Ephesus, like the other places he stayed at for long periods, was a significant place. This is quoting from Brother John Carter in his letter to the Ephesians book. Ephesus was a wealthy, populous, important city, the capital of the province of Asia. The province as a whole was prosperous and was covered with numerous towns such as those addressed in the Apocalypse. In Paul's day, Ephesus was at the height of its prosperity. It was situated at the mouth of the Meander and at the entrance to the principal trade route to the interior. It was the residence of the Roman proconsul in whose court the majesty of Rome was amply displayed. The city also had a religious attraction. On the site of the primitive sanctuary, a temple had been erected, and here was maintained a survival of nature worship. The goddess was identified by the Greeks with Artemis and with Diana by the Romans. The temple was one of the wonders of the world, and to it pilgrimage was made. Superstition and magic had a stronghold, and many vested interests supported the religious practices. And of course our knowledge from Acts, particularly of Paul's time there, will recognise a lot of those features. But why would you even think of going to Ephesus in the first place if that's what it's like? We haven't got the same comment as was the case with Corinth, that I have much people in this city, but clearly the Lord did. And it's just another reminder of something we've discussed before, of the difficulty we have in being able to tell whether God has much people in any given location. It's very difficult for us to know in that sense what the will of the Lord is. And I guess it's just a reminder for us not to be too smart in our own thinking. Leave a bit more to the Lord to guide us, because so often where we thought it would be pointless going to stay in that place and to preach and to try and spread the gospel, turns out to be a very fruitful field. And sometimes areas we think would be fruitful turn out not to be. I think it's just a salutary lesson for us. We have a lot of information about the Ecclesia at Ephesus. We've touched on most of these references in Acts, but just to remind you, he stopped there on his way to Jerusalem back in chapter 18. We've read about Apollos. We've now talked about his 3-year stay, and on his way back to Jerusalem, he meets the elders at Miletus. We also then find that others were involved in that ecclesia. Paul left Timothy there during his travels after his release from prison. We pick that up in 1 Timothy 1. And of course, Jesus wrote a letter to that ecclesia in Revelation chapter 2. Clearly a very significant ecclesia. And why wouldn't it have been after 3 years of the apostles' work in that place and building it up and establishing it? Well, we'll now expand beyond Ephesus. But I just want to show you one little snippet from this third journey. You may or may not really have thought about this much, but in Acts 20, verse 13, Luke records, "And we went before to ship and sailed unto Assos, there intending to take in Paul, for so he had appointed, minding himself to go afoot." Well, that map illustrates the place that we're talking about. At the top is Troas. They got to Troas, and the boat continued down the coast and around the bottom to Assos in the bottom right-hand corner. But the Apostle Paul alone said, "I'm going to walk across country and I'll meet you at Assos." That's the only time I think that we come across that sort of odd incident. All the rest of them sailed around in the ship around the coast. I haven't tried to work out which is faster. I'm guessing the ship would be faster depending on the prevailing winds. And so how they timed this, did he say, "Well, I'll meet you on a certain day," or I don't know. The details are interesting but not significant. What is significant is that he felt the need for exercise, but to be alone. And there's an interesting little summary of this by Brother Michael Owen in an article some years ago. Luke seems to have enjoyed travel, and particularly by sea, whereas Paul decided to take the opportunity for quiet reflection and exercise by walking from Troas some 20 miles south to Assos. Luke chose to go by sea. I'm sure there's times in our lives where we feel the need to be alone. Sometimes we are alone not by choice, and that can be very difficult too, of course. But there are times, and it may not be for such a long period, that would take a couple of days, I guess, to walk 20 miles. I've never tried to do that in one go, but I'm sure it's not just a couple of hours, that's for sure. And there are times when, for whatever reason, there is a need for some real reflection and meditation, and that's part of the apostle's life. He wasn't so driven that he could not take such a break, not just from preaching, but from even his fellow brethren on the ship. Of course, we ought not to reverse the picture and say that, well, we'll just spend our life in isolation and have nothing to do with the brethren, except maybe once a year we'll go and visit somewhere. I think that's not healthy and not wise. But clearly, even the apostle needed this little short period in his otherwise incredibly busy and compact life for quiet reflection. And I think that's just a very interesting little observation along the way. Now, I've tried to summarise the Apostle Paul's care for the Ecclesias. We read that in our reading, if you want to come with me to that. We'll pick it up just to reinforce it again. 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 28 has been read for us. He says, beside those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the Ecclesias. And we'll tease this out a little more. But first of all, after the first journey, the apostle wanted to go on his second journey, which we've covered previously. He wanted to see how they do. Having gone through the second journey and thinking about a third journey, we read that he wanted to strengthen all the disciples. And so twice, preceding the second and the third journey, You can see his desire, in particular in Galatia, because that's where he founded the first Ecclesias, to go back and to go back again. And that's a very powerful lesson for all of us, and we'll see that, how that relates to our own time as we develop this thought. But there are many other things the apostle did and says about himself that expand on this. So, for example, in this chapter, maybe not as obvious as the one in 1 Corinthians 4, but verse 2 we've already had reason to quote. He talks about espousing you to one husband. Well, who does that? Who espouses their daughter to a husband but the father? And we may not normally pick that out of that verse, but he is saying, I'm effectively your father. The Ecclesia at Corinth, I'm your father. And so I'm espousing you, I have espoused you to Christ. So his view of his role, of his position and his relationship to these brethren was as a father. Towards the latter part of the chapter, of course, he talks about how much he had suffered for them. Not just those physical troubles that he experienced on behalf of all of the brethren, but in particular this care of all the ecclesias daily. We'll come back to that. We've noticed that he resided in particular in Corinth and Ephesus for several years each. Such was his care and concern for them. He wrote 14 letters, and some others at least, that we haven't got in our scriptures, but which we can deduce. We've seen that he prayed for them frequently. They were always in his prayers. And he furthermore sent others to help them, Timothy and Titus, for example. So all of this is illustrative of his lifelong care for the brethren, not just preaching and moving on. Well, what about us? I'm not trying to say we should somehow tick off that list and say, yes, I've done this, I've done this. I don't mean it that way. But what about our care for others? And not simply individuals. There's certainly a very important place for our care for individuals in need. But our thoughts this morning are not about the individuals. They are about the body of Christ, the Ecclesia. What's our attitude to the whole body of Christ? What sort of concerns or caring thoughts do we have for the whole brotherhood? Or do in fact we think of the brotherhood as a whole much at all? Are we so preoccupied with our own lives and perhaps just our own ecclesia and maybe one or two others nearby? That's it, as far as our thinking goes, most of the time. Or are we so much more conscious of the fact that we are but a tiny part of this worldwide brotherhood? And all of those brethren and sisters, whatever country they're in and whatever colour their skin, whatever language they speak, are as close to us as the brother or sister sitting next to us here, in our minds. And many of us have travelled and visited places where we are able to meet with a few of these brothers and sisters. And I'm sure we've all found in those experiences this amazing sense of unity and of closeness with people we have never met, not even thought of. I haven't met all of you before, but there's a kind of semi-knowledge of each other. We kind of know of your ecclesia, or we may know someone else in your ecclesia, and there's a certain amount of ready familiarity here, isn't there? But if you go to some country where they don't look like you and they don't talk like you, there's a stronger sense of Christ has bridged the gaps that would otherwise be there between our cultures and theirs. And it really needs to be something, I think, very prominent in our thinking, in our prayers, in our discussion, in the way our ecclesia functions. And there are many ways that can be done. But one of the things I want to say to us, most of us, there's one or two here who are younger than me, so I can kind of, not entirely, but sort of drop them out of my comments here, although it's relevant really to everyone. We're all elders in the Ecclesia. We have a very special responsibility. It isn't simply that we've grown old. I know some of you don't like saying old. I'm quite comfortable with saying I'm old. I don't have a problem with that, but I know some of you are a bit sensitive about that. But so just forgive me if I might make you feel uncomfortable unintentionally. We've got to this stage. We've learnt a lot. We have learnt a huge amount through the scriptures, through life experience. Why? What are you doing with it? What was the point of all that? Simply so that you could die with a head full of knowledge? No. We're all here because we're elders in the Ecclesia of God. We have a great responsibility to act in our individual ecclesias, particularly as elders, and to do those things that elders should do. The apostle was clearly an elder. Okay, he had a special commission, and we cannot draw a perfect parallel between us and the apostle in that sense. But there's a few clues there, isn't there, about what elders are to do, what you and I must do. And we should all feel a little uncomfortable, I do, as to what extent am I even thinking about being an elder? Or have I got sucked into our Western culture and saying that, well, this time of life is where we sit back and enjoy the fruits of our labours, we take it easy, we buy a more comfortable lounge chair, whatever, because we've done the hard yards. Let the young ones pick this up. And I'm not trying to make too many allusions to last night, but on the serious side of last night, it should make us think a little, that it's clearly important for us to not only pass on the baton, which is a very apt analogy. That doesn't mean you say, whew, I finally got rid of that job, I can sit back and relax. That isn't the idea. We ought to maintain, in fact, if you could think through this, even have more enthusiasm than we had when we were young. Because now we understand what we're enthusiastic about so much better. We ought to be so excited by the fact that we've matured to the degree we have, that we see things so much better than we did when we were 20 or 30 years old. Don't we? Sure we do. But what's the impression we give to our younger brothers and sisters? Do we have a rapport with them at all? Do we chat with the young brother after he's given a talk and give very constructive and tactful advice and support them, encourage them, give them as many roles as they can manage, bearing in mind they have a young family usually. And we need to ensure that they have time with their children and with their wives, particularly talking about young brethren. You know, a study has been done in Australia of how much time the typical father spends with his children per day, one-on-one. It's less than 1 minute. If that ever is true of any young brother, that's shocking. Our families, in most cases, become the future family of God. And a father must never, ever abrogate that responsibility. And we as elders need to be conscious of how much we load on young brethren, particularly with younger children. little bit off the subject, but it's, I think, a very pertinent message for us as people who've got past that stage generally. There are some other terms used, quite a few terms used by the apostle, but by extension applying to all of us. We won't turn them up. These are familiar ones, I'm sure, to you. We are described in Scripture, and the apostle uses this term of himself as being a shepherd. And we don't need to think long about what that implies, of being out in front and looking for the green pastures and the water for the sheep, of making sure that there are no obstacles in their way, of making sure that any wild animals are sent off or killed if necessary. The shepherd had this job. He would give his life for the sheep. We're shepherds. So tick all those off in your mind. We are also servants. All of us are servants. All ages are servants. But we in particular, we don't say, well, we've done our service and we've reached whatever age you think is enough. Not 50, Brother John. We don't say, well, let the young ones take over now. We are servants of the brotherhood. We have many other terms, members of a body. We're all indispensable parts, as Paul goes through in 1 Corinthians and emphasises the fact that none of us can say either the body doesn't need me or I don't need the body. Neither are valid comments or thoughts. We have to think about being followers of Christ, and as he has done and does for us, still, we need to do for one another, because we're members of his family. And of course it's so helpful to us to, as we do, call each other's brothers and sisters. But I wonder sometimes if that term, that frequency of using that expression has kind of lost its point. If you've got a brother or sister in the flesh, you know that, as the saying is, blood is thicker than water. You know that you never ever lose that sense of a very special relationship, different to everyone else. And that special nature of our relationship as brothers and sisters needs to be at the forefront of our minds as much as possible. And so, as we look then more carefully at this whole issue of caring, in the chapter dealing with the body, 1 Corinthians 12, let's have a look at that. If you've still got 2 Corinthians there, it's not far away. 1 Corinthians 12. In going through this long description of the body and the different parts of the body and how it needs to see its interdependence, which would be interesting to look at, but not now. We come all the way down the chapter to verse 25, that there should be no schism in the body, but that the members should have the same care one for another. Every one of us should have real, genuine care for one another. Now, I know some of you are difficult to care about. Some of you are a little bit odd. You've got these little idiosyncrasies. But then, so have I. So have you. We need to see through that and see, here's one of God's children. And we really need to have a strong sense of care. Let those idiosyncrasies wash over us. With some of you, I could give you quite a list. No, some of you I know well, and we all know that's true, don't we? We don't see them, of course. We don't see them, or we may see a little bit. But if you get very close to someone who's prepared to put a mirror up to you in a gentle way, you suddenly think, well, I suppose I am a bit odd, aren't I? And I have got some funny ways and some funny little prejudices. And, when you see that person, you go, oh, yeah, yes, that, steel yourself for this a little, We're all like that. We're not the odd one out. We're not the one person in this room who's normal. Because there's no such thing, really, is there? And somehow we have to ignore all that and have the same care one for another. Because it's the very epitome of family, of reflecting the way, as Brother John said so clearly today, the way God treated his people. People who didn't deserve any of the things that he did for them. In the face of their rebellion, he still blessed them. And that's the same care that we need to have for one another. When we've done things to one another that are offensive, upsetting, possibly unintentional, and who knows whether it was ever intentional or unintentional that someone said something to us that was very upsetting. How often have you done that? Blissfully ignorant, and the person's gone away deeply hurt, never said anything to you. I'm sure it's happened many times. We've all done it. But we have to see beyond those things. We have this absolutely beautiful statement about Timothy. Timothy will naturally care for your state. Wow, wouldn't that be lovely if we knew that's how the Lord saw us? That you, brother, you, sister, will naturally care for the state of another. What a beautiful thing that is. May that be so of all of us. But while we're talking about caring, there are things we're told not to care about. Don't care about this world. Don't care about this life. Don't care about tomorrow. Don't care about anything. And there, of course, the emphasis is on worry and anxiety. Sometimes we stick little cartoons on the fridge out of the newspaper or wherever. And some years ago we had a cartoon of husband and wife, or father and mother to make it even more clear. And the father says to the mother, you know, why are you worrying so much? And she says, because I'm a mother, it's my job. And I'm not saying that mothers shouldn't have that care for their family in particular. But it's hard, isn't it? It's really hard not to worry. It's extremely difficult to cast all your care upon the Lord, for he careth for you. And it isn't because we don't trust him, I don't think. I think it's simply because we're weak. We're acutely conscious that there's so many things that we wish we could control, but we can't. And we worry and we lose sleep and we wet our pillows with our tears because we're worried. And I don't think we'll ever escape that until we're immortal. But we do at times need to somehow pull ourselves back from that and be a little more reflective about ourselves. Be conscious of the fact that we are in God's care and that we too care for one another. And we've addressed that a little bit previously, particularly talking about prayer and praying for others and telling them so. Because these are all ways of showing that we do care and that God cares. And we will all be caring for you and endeavour to help you and support you in your time of need. Now, I want to give a few examples or illustrations of all of this. Some of you will be well aware that Brother Robert Roberts had some very good points and some very bad points. One of his bad points was money. He was hopeless. And it's well written up. He acknowledges it all in great detail in his biography and in other material that we can read in copies of the Christadelphian of over 100 years ago. Hopeless with money. And perhaps you might think of some other things that you might not think he was perfect in, but I want to just focus on that just for a moment. He invested his money and encouraged others to do so too in schemes that came to an absolute disaster, where they lost the lot. Not once, but again. And it would have been a third one if the brethren at Birmingham hadn't got him in a corner, so to speak, and just said, you must never, ever have anything more to do with handling money and recommending what people do with money. And he acknowledged the wisdom of their advice and agreed not to get involved in anything like this ever again. And you know the reason he came to Australia? Was very much tied up with that problem. There were two reasons in effect, but they're linked. One was because he was an incredibly sick man. He was very sick, in fact died at 59. Many of us are quite a bit older than that. And he did it because he got sick with distress and worry and disappointment. And with good reason, in the sense that he had dealt with some extraordinarily distressing situations, and it affected his health. And one of those complicating factors was the disasters that he got involved in financially as well. And you might think, well, surely somewhere in his earlier part of his life he would have figured out that he wasn't good with money. Or even others might have suggested that much earlier. Why did it get to such a huge scale, not once but twice and almost 3 times? And it's interesting, I think, just to read what his motive was. He wanted to get this money because he wanted to fund the Jewish colonisation of the Holy Land, was to be helped, as no Gentile and no Jew after the flesh either feels moved to help it. The truth was to be published both by lecture and literature as it has never been in this generation. The poor were to be helped as never in our age has been possible. Every grievous load among the brethren under which private hearts are bleeding was to be undone. An institution for the annual recuperation of the ailing by a 3 weeks free stay, to which railway fare would be paid to and from, was to be provided. What are our motives for accumulating our wealth? Few of us probably could say even one of those was our motive. He had feet of clay, but I think I've got feet of sand. They won't support anything. I don't have those motives for what I have, and I suspect either none or perhaps few of you do. All of his care was for both natural Israel and spiritual Israel. If you read through all of the writings of Brother Roberts, as I've done recently, every article, every editorial, every news item for the whole of his life, it becomes very clear that the overwhelming desire in his heart was to help his brethren, not merely by lecturing and not merely by writing wonderful and profound articles on some scriptural topic, but month after month after month he talks about this brother or this sister or this family who are destitute, and appealing for the brethren to contribute donations to help them. And you may well be aware that his own life was one where he never owned a house. In fact, That's not quite right. He did own a house. It was given to him by a brother for nothing. It was Brother Firth in Melbourne. Gave him free of charge Orient House, which is just still standing. I went and had a look at it earlier this year, and it's in a pretty poor state of repair. Might not last much longer. But he never bought it, never had, as it were, 2 cents to rub together. Because whatever he did have, it was all used for the benefit of others. An extraordinary man in that respect. His care was for others at his own expense, not just financially expense either. Now our reading was, as we just saw a moment ago, 2 Corinthians 11. And you may have picked this up, but let's just make sure we don't miss it. Verse 28 said, 2 Corinthians 11 verse 28, beside those things that are without, and he's given us a long list of all these things that were without, all the privations that he went through. He says, beside all that, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the Ecclesias. Now here's an interesting comment. I could do no better than just quote it from Brother Peter Watkins on this very point. We can all readily understand how these things that we've just read about would be painful to bear, each one of them a deep affliction. But there is one of them which Paul mentions amongst his afflictions, which many people simply would not be able to understand. Quoting, beside those things which are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches, verse 28. One gets the impression that this was the more grievous burden, heavier than any of the other things that Paul had to bear. The other things happened occasionally, but this burden and care of all the churches was always with him, day in, day out. So completely did the apostle identify himself with his brothers and his sisters that he felt for them and suffered anxiety for them. So he continues, who is weak and I am not weak? Who is offended and I burn not? It reminds one, doesn't it, of on the road to Damascus when the Lord intervened in Saul's life. He said to Saul, you are persecuting me. Well, he wasn't. He was persecuting the brethren. But the brethren were Christ. They were our Lord Jesus. Everything we feel, he feels. And Paul was such a model of Christ himself. Everything, every brother and sister in every ecclesia that he knew of, and those that even that he didn't know of, whenever he heard of some difficulty, he felt it. It was as if it was happening to him, just like the Lord felt and does feel when any of us are suffering. He's suffering with us. Now, lifting it away from perhaps the emotional for a moment and to the little more considered thoughts, I want to quote you a couple of paragraphs from Brother Michael Ashton on the whole issue of where this fits into our lives. He's actually talking about Stephen in Acts 7 in this context. Anyway, that doesn't matter. It would be wrong, however, to categorise Paul as being involved only in missionary work with no interest in or understanding of the constraints of ecclesial life. Part of the legacy he received from Stephen, as we considered last month, involved the daily care of brethren and sisters. And he spoke himself of a wider responsibility too, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches, as we've just read. But it is the case that a balanced ecclesial life involves both the edification of its individual constituents in the faith and the exhibition of the light of the truth to those that are without. And that's Robert Roberts from the Ecclesial Guide. undue concentration on one of these aspects to the exclusion or even to the detriment of the other will make it difficult to have a balanced assessment on many matters. And perhaps the Pharisees in the Jerusalem Ecclesia were too involved with internal affairs to see the wider picture. And so much in our life is all about balance, is it not? Brother Islip Collier had some beautiful similes to illustrate that, which you may be familiar with the cart and the big load of hay getting unbalanced. It's so clear, isn't it, that in so many things in our life we have to find balances. And they change over time. So that, for example, before I was married, I had all sorts of different priorities in my life. When I got married, my wife's now my priority. Then you have children and they are added to your priorities. And then as you mature in the faith, you have more and more ecclesial responsibilities. Then your children leave home and the balance shifts again. And now I don't work for a living. I try to survive on my savings until I get the pension. And the balance has changed again. And it will change again in another couple of months in that sense. And so life goes on, it keeps changing. And we need to constantly sense that shift in our lives and get adjustments to ensure that we are balanced and we've got everything in its place. We've talked about the care of the Ecclesias. I want to focus now, just for a few minutes to finish with, on a particular aspect of care. You may have tended to think of what I've been saying as more caring for people's personal, family or health or even financial difficulties and that kind of thing. And that's great, that's fine. But there's another sense in which we need to care. Come with me to Ephesians. And it's just interesting that it happens to be in Ephesians, given the context of this being the third journey and that the apostles spent 3 whole years in Ephesus. And he says something in chapter 4, which is a very special sense of our care for one another. In chapter 4 of Ephesians, verse 3, endeavouring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. That's an unfortunate translation, really, because in English today, if you said I'm endeavouring to do something, we kind of read that as meaning, well, I'm a bit half-hearted about it. I'll endeavour to do it. It's a bit like saying, well, I'll try to fit it in somewhere. That is not at all the sense of what Paul's trying to say here. If we look at a couple of other versions, we'll see that very clearly. Tyndale Diaglott, the NASB and Rotherham all use the word diligent. Well, that's clear, but it's perhaps a word we don't use frequently, so it may not quite hit home. The ESV says eager. The NIV and Barclay, I think even more clearly, say make every effort. Weymouth and Schonfield translated as striving, hence my title, striving for unity. Now the word in the Greek, and I don't know how to say it, something like spoudazo, it means to have haste. It's sort of perhaps reminiscent of the English word speed. Perhaps, I don't know if it is connected, but it's similar sound, isn't it? And so whatever this striving, whatever this endeavouring is all about, is something I want to just develop. It's used in other places in the King James translation as to be forward. That's referring to when Paul was very keen to establish a poor fund for the saints in Jerusalem. Really keen. When they asked him to do it, he said, well, that's my highest priority. I'm really keen to do that. That's the sense of the word. Study, and it doesn't mean study in the modern English sense. It means to be diligent, to make every effort, to strive in the context of making sure that our lives are governed by the Word of God. It's translated as diligence in several places and labour in Hebrews 4. All of this is emphasising the amount of effort we must put in to keeping the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And a further point, as you see at the top there, the Greek, according to a reference book I've got, is that this word is to be understood in the continuous sense, and I suppose the English does convey that with the ing on the end. It's a constant effort. This is not something where we form a committee and try to do something to improve the unity of the brotherhood, and we get to a point and say, well, we've done that, now we'll turn our mind to something else. This is a constant, daily, lifelong responsibility for every single one of us to do what we can, wherever we can, in whatever way we can, to strive for unity. And it would take some time, which I'm not going to do today, Brother Chairman, you'll be relieved to know, to go off and to explain why unity is such a fundamental issue. And it's simply this: because God is one. And if you understand what I mean, that's great. If you don't, we'll talk about it some other time. There's a very potent statement by Brother Nichols, on this very point. To rashly provoke faction or division is as much a denial of the truth as any of the causes which may ultimately make righteous separation inevitable. Nor should we complacently accept the current divided state of the brotherhood without making any attempt to reconcile and heal. For the fundamentals of our faith demand that we should be continually striving for unity amongst those for whom Christ died. Personally, I wish he'd added a little bit in the middle of that. When he talks about the current divided state of the brotherhood, I don't think he's talking about fellowship divisions at all. Because in fact, well over 90% of all of those in the world who call themselves Christadelphians are in our central fellowship. We are, in that sense, not a divided community. But in another sense, we are. Now, I believe we have made some good progress in this country in that regard. I made the comment to someone, I think last night, that many of us would not be here if this was 30 years ago. And I'm sure many of you understand what I mean. The situation in our community was decidedly divided and unhealthy. And there were lots of differences that caused us to avoid one another. Not formally, in the sense that there was no formal division. We weren't out of fellowship with one another. But we were a divided community, and particularly so in this country. We have made some progress, but the labour is not done by a long way. And I think we do need to understand that if we do anything that exacerbates the degree of disunity that might exist anywhere, we have denied a fundamental principle of the truth, and that is the unity of God. And I think there's some wonderful things that are going on and that we can expand and reinforce and add to. We have the AEST, which is a unifying group. We have care groups. We have care and accommodation for the aged, Bible mission, preaching campaigns and the exhibition, agape in action, the hymn book, conferences and Bible schools. And you could probably add to the list. There are good things happening that help us to appreciate that we are indeed one body. And with all our idiosyncrasies and foibles and cultural differences, we need to focus on that and work at it so that when our Lord comes, we may all have an abundant entrance into his glorious kingdom. Thank you.